Hello, and welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things related to the Christian faith. I'm the Ryan half of Ryan and Brian, and this is episode number 53. Today, Brian and I are talking about the culture, history, and archaeology of the crucifixion. We take a look at the true purpose of crucifixion, how even the Jews used crucifixion before the Romans, and some archaeology that illuminates the crucifixion of Jesus. Before we get started, just a quick reminder that you can find us at thebiblebistro.com, on Instagram and Facebook at The Bible Bistro. You can watch us on YouTube as well at Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. If you are watching us there, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. We've also set up a Patreon account, so if you're enjoying the podcast and would like to support our work financially, you can do that. You can find a link for that in the show notes, but also by going to the website, thebiblebistro.com, and clicking on the link at the top. If you can't financially support us, you could also support the Bistro by simply sharing the podcast with others or leaving us a review on Apple Podcast. That helps as well. All right, let's jump right into our conversation about the crucifixion. Hey, Brian, welcome back to the Bistro.
Hey, Ryan, good to be in the Bistro again. What a good day.
Yes, it is. It is a good day. We're doing this on a Saturday, so it's pretty laid back, you know?
Yeah,
pretty
you
chill.
know, I'm in my flannels today. I've been doing a little housework and that kind of stuff. So.
Have you? Yeah. I'm in a button-up Carhartt, so it's a little different. It's kind
your
of
typical Carhartt.
I'm usually in the T-shirt, but I call these button-ups my Saturday shirt because it's like I don't care shirt.
Throw this out there for any Carhartt marketing representative listening that.
If you're looking for an in between faith communities and Carhartt,
Ryan is a huge fan.
Of the Bible Bistro.
Ryan is a huge Carhartt fan.
Is that a fat joke?
No, you're a big.
You said I'm a huge.
You're a big.
I'm a huge fan.
You're an extra large
you're
fan.
You're defining the fan as huge. I can't believe it. I can't believe we're having this conversation.
What size Carhartt do you wear?
Don't worry about it, Brian.
Okay.
Man-sized. That's what I wear.
Okay.
Anyway, with that slight, if we were in person and you made that joke, I'd have walked up on a stage and slapped you across the face.
Little cultural reference for anybody that saw the Oscars this last week. Man, did you see? Well, this isn't really.
Keep my shirt size out of your mouth.
This isn't really what we're talking about today, but he just resigned from the Academy. So I didn't know if you saw that.
Did he really?
Yeah, he did just today.
Breaking news.
You heard it here first, maybe.
You heard it here first.
Of course.
Also, the movie After Earth starring Will Smith is horrible and like a slap in the face.
You heard it here first.
So if you want to get slapped in the face by Will Smith, watch the movie After Earth.
Oh, that's terrible.
It is a terrible movie.
And there, of course, a lot of people talking about that. So, but anyway, that's not what we're talking about.
We're not talking about this. We're actually going to talk about the Bible.
You know, when this episode comes out it'll be the Tuesday before the Sunday that we often call Palm Sunday, and so interesting thing. Then, of course, the week after that's Easter, and so we thought we would talk leading up to kind of this final week. This important week in our calendar between Palm Sunday and Easter. We thought we'd talk about the crucifixion of Jesus, but in a different way, kind of in light of the archaeology and the culture of the time. Just some of the details that we find in the Gospels will be a little bit interesting, and so I think that's kind of a way for us to prepare for and lead up to this thing of thinking about the crucifixion. And then we want to talk about resurrection and the following Tuesday, just to kind of prepare people for that. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sounds good.
One of the things that I always said we talked about atonement in another episode, you might remember, and talked about it quite a bit. There's a book, I can't remember if I mentioned it then or not, but one of the first books I read on atonement that was very influential for me was Leon Morris, an Australian biblical scholar, really good scholar. It's an older book now. I mean, like all the books I've read now are older books.
Like
right?
it's old.
That's exactly right. But the Leon Morris's book on atonement was one of the first I read, and I always recommend to people who are going to be preaching or working on the worship service. I always said that's a good book to read leading up to Easter, kind of remind us of the significance of it. But then there's another little book. Now this is an older book too. I think it was originally published in 1977 by a German scholar by the name of Martin Hengel. and I think it's only, oh goodness, I think 90 pages long, maybe. It's a book called Crucifixion, and it's talking about crucifixion in the ancient context. And I always said that was a good one to read as well. Now, I'm going to tell you, if you pick that book up today, it is as dry as dust. I mean, all he does is he goes through all of the ancient evidence that we have for crucifixion. But as you read these texts that we have available on what crucifixion's significance was, Josephus, as we mentioned before, Josephus before, talks about it, and I'm going to give you a couple of quotations from Josephus a little bit later on. And if you look at the kind of the archaeological evidence we have for crucifixion, historical and archaeological evidence, it just becomes very obvious what an incredible, how do I want to say this? It gives you a sense of the weight of what crucifixion was in the Roman world, and what a shame, in a sense, it brought upon the person who was crucified. And again, I think that's a good thing for us to think about leading up to, as we think about Good Friday, as we think about the final week, Palm Sunday into Good Friday. Even before I'll go into that, I'll mention it's kind of interesting. Like I said, for us, it's 7 days out of the calendar, right? Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday. But the interesting thing is, even we had John Wedley on, I think it would
last week.
Last week. And when John was talking about that these are passion narratives with extended introductions, somewhere around 50% of the material, and I know I've mentioned this before, but somewhere around 50% of the material we have in all four Gospels focuses upon this 1 week in the life of Jesus. And so, there's a lot of material to get through. But again, I kind of want to just focus on the significance, not only of crucifixion, but I thought also burial. So we'll talk about crucifixion, burial this week, and then resurrection next week. Was kind of my idea. And we maybe, have you ever heard a sermon, Ryan, where kind of you've had very graphically described the death of Jesus, someone kind of describing the function of crucifixion?
Yeah, I think, I'm sure I've heard it a couple times.
Right.
It became real popular when the Passion of the Christ came out.
Right.
It was like,
to kind of be,
like this.
Go into very graphic detail. And that's not really, I'll go ahead and say that's not really my purpose today, but my purpose is more to kind of talk about, not the, how do I say this, the biological details of how crucifixion took place, but more just kind of the significance, what the Romans used it for, and that kind of thing. That's kind of what I thought we would discuss and talk about. So the first thing I'll talk about, and I just thought something else I need to say first. One more thing.
Classic.
Yeah. The other thing I'll say is we talk a lot about how we have to be careful that our perception of the biblical text and what the Bible actually says, how much it is influenced by our own culture and by images and this kind of thing. I was thinking about this in preparing for this. The crucifixion of Jesus has to be one of the most, I would say, it's reproduced artworks in the world, if you will. In other words, that's not a good way to say it, but the number of artists who have painted paintings about that have to do with the crucifixion of Jesus, and different artistic, even crosses. Most churches have crosses on them, and I can remember a youth group. I always thought this was a pretty cool thing, but when each of the youth became a member of that congregation, they would choose a cross, and they had a wall kind of on one wall that had all different kinds of crosses on it. If you can imagine, Celtic crosses, as we say, or different styles of crosses. So our understanding of the crucifixion is very strongly influenced by artwork, by movies. You mentioned The Passion of the Christ. Even before that, you think about some of the great Jesus films that were out there, were done by these incredible directors, and of course they were very artistic in their approach to the crucifixion, the lighting, and all this kind of thing. And so all that's kind of influenced us, I think. Even as a kid, I remember growing up, and there was a cross in the front of the church that I grew up in, and so every Sunday that so that's kind of my perception, and the reason I say that is that when we look historically and even archaeologically, as much as we are able to, we'll see sometimes those artists may have taken some liberties with the way that they've presented this. That's the only thing I want to say that to begin with. So the first thing I'll say about crucifixion, it was always very public. I think again, Dr. Whitley mentioned this when we had him on. It was done. Intentionally done in a way that people could see. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this. One is that what we believe to be the site of Jesus' crucifixion was outside the walls of the city. That's very clear from the New Testament witness and from, again, ancient historical witness as well. It would not be something that would be done inside the city, but it was done, we believe, on one of the major routes that you would take into the city. So near a gate, as you would make your way into the city of Jerusalem. And we can see this in the gospel accounts. It talks about those who were passing by would see Jesus and they would hurl insults at him and kind of mock him. So the Romans intentionally made crucifixion a very public event because they were trying to send a message. Overall, I would say this, that crucifixion for the Romans was about control. It was about showing who was in charge. It was about making clear that you can't get away with trying to lead a rebellion. That was a time that crucifixions were used. You can't go against Roman authority. It was a way to it's not just doing away with the criminal. You see what I'm saying? And doing away with it, but it was also to send a message to the entire nation. In our case, we're thinking about Judea, but even in other parts of the Roman Empire, they would crucify in order to kind of show that they are the ones who are in charge, and you'd better not challenge Rome.
And that's kind of in juxtaposition to how we as a nation, there's the capital punishment, where it's more of like trying to even give dignity to the person who's being executed. There's only a certain number of people that can see, and it's the way that we administer. But this was in the exact opposite. Is we're punishing you, and we want everybody
to know it.
Everyone's gonna. It's not just they're gonna know you're bad, and this is why you're up there.
So one of the ways I would describe is public humiliation. Really, it was to be a humiliating thing. One of the, and this gets a little sensitive, I understand, but one of the, of course, artists always depict Jesus as kind of having this, cloth draped around his midsection, to obviously, but very likely victims of crucifixion would typically have been crucified naked. Again, it's a sign of shame being brought upon them. Sign of their nakedness, of their vulnerability, that they're dying, right? And Rome is the one who's doing this. So, a couple things that are a little bit more difficult than. Let me just say a couple things that we sometimes may have different, and I'll talk about some of the archaeology. Of course, we don't have a ton of archaeology about crucifixion because the crosses were primarily made of wood, and wood typically is not something that lasts. So it's something that, first of all, it would often be reused. Now, in the case of a cross, there probably would be a certain amount of stigma attached to it, but wood, especially in Palestine, was a relatively rare commodity, something that you would want to use, but then also it would rot if it were left out. It would not be maintained long term. So if you think about archaeologically, most of the things we find are stone, or they fossilized, or different things like this.
This was a tool. This wasn't something to be kept around or cherished. It was a tool for punishment.
And that people have talked about that. We kind of glorify the cross now, and I think rightfully so, in the sense that we understand the significance of what happened on the cross. When we talk about atonement, we understand Christ dying on our behalf. So, but we make them very polished. We make them very, like you'll see them in gold. People wear them around their necks. And in the ancient world, that's definitely not the way they would have been viewed, especially if you continue to live under Roman Empire. The cross was not seen as something that was, something precious. It would have been quite the opposite. In fact, Paul even talks about this later on. Paul talks about this idea that it's a scandal, right? This idea that Jesus was crucified as a criminal, and this would be something that people would point to and say, how could this be someone you're now worshiping, or someone you're now pointing to as the giver of life, is this crucified criminal.
So first century Palestinians probably weren't carrying around little wooden crosses in their pockets.
Not. Definitely not. And that's, again, if you think about them at the front of the church, and again, I'm not criticizing that. There's a place for that, and it focuses our attention on this. Again, we have to think about the significance. But in the first century, some people I've heard people say that it'd be like us wearing an electric chair around our necks or something like that. And not exactly, but again, it was a symbol of Roman oppression. And so, no, I don't think they would have glorified it, other than, again, focusing on that it is through crucifixion, through Jesus' death on the cross, that we have, the way to God.
Yeah, the cross represented the doorway that Jesus had opened. Yeah, it wasn't glorifying the cross itself, but the doorway that Christ had opened.
The other thing I think, just in terms of thinking about the cross, what we believe from descriptions, again, this is an artistic choice that we've kind of gotten used to. I think most crosses in the ancient world would have not been as tall as they're typically depicted, even in Easter pageants or that kind of thing. They were very utilitarian. And think about how difficult it would be to get to
hoist someone up,
someone up into a high position. It would be a very difficult thing, and so I think that hold on a second, sorry. Just got distracted by something.
That's all right. The height of the cross.
Yeah, the height of the cross. To try to get someone into that high position would have been very difficult. These were utilitarian. So typically what would happen, here's the other thing that's described. So you tell me, you've sat through lots of Good Friday services and maybe a couple of Easter pageants or two, or three maybe. But
yeah.
So Jesus, we know that he was scourged, he was beaten, he was whipped, he was mocked. The mocking centered on him being called king, which is really what he's being crucified for. Again, in Rome, you didn't declare yourself a king. You didn't have followers declare yourself a king, or you would be considered an usurper, a revolutionary, somebody who's trying to come in and upset the Roman authority. And so
Rome doesn't like that.
Right. You remember they put a robe of purple on him. They put a crown of thorns on him and mocked him and this kind of thing. And then he begins to go to Golgotha, and we have this detail that they find someone in the crowd. Do you remember his name is Simon Cyrene?
Simon. Mm-hmm.
And they find him and have him do what? What do they have him do?
Carry the cross.
Carry the cross for Jesus. Now, the way that's often depicted, again, in Easter pageants, wherever Jesus stumbles, there's a lot of tradition within Roman Catholicism about that stumbling. And if you go to Jerusalem today, there's a place where supposedly he stumbled and put his hand out and this kind of thing. But then we have the whole cross basically being carried by Simon Cyrene. Probably what would happen is they probably left what they call the uprights or the stipes in place where the crucifixion would take place, and what's being carried is just the cross beam. That's one thing that is sometimes depicted in a different way. So what Simon's probably carrying is just the cross beam that Jesus would have been affixed to. And then we see them taken to this place that's called Golgotha, which we're told in Aramaic is the place of the skull. And I'll come back to that probably when we get more to the burial, but we think it's because there's two different possibilities. It could be that it was in the shape of a skull. In other words, you looked at this hill or this cliff, and it would have looked like a skull. And there's good reason to think that that's a possibility. Or the other possibility could be that crucifixion victims, it is thought, were seldom buried, were usually not buried. And so you would imagine this being a place where human remains might have been around. So some people think it's a place of the skull because there would be human bones there, like the skull and that kind of thing. But we can come back to that in a little bit later. So most of these were probably shorter again. It wasn't these tall, very elaborate kind of things. It would probably have been a short, basically just tall enough to do the job, which is just to lift someone off the ground high enough that they couldn't, put their feet down, basically. And so, and even the way that sometimes they were crucified, it'd even be shorter than that. But it was probably not a tall thing. The other kind of question, there's a controversy about this, is there's some evidence that if you can imagine a capital T as opposed to a lowercase t. So a cross we typically think of in the shape of a lowercase t, but there's some evidence that at least some crosses in Rome were capital T, if you can imagine that, the crossbar then. And again, you can, utilitarian wise, it's just much easier to attach to the top than, kind of halfway up to either tie it or however it was done there. So some people think that it would have been kind of a capital T. Now,
but
go ahead.
Now, how would they have put the sign?
That's usually the question that then's answered. So we know that Pilate does this to kind of twerk the Jewish authorities a little bit, to kind of tweak them in the nose a little bit and make fun of them. But he affixes a sign that says "King of the Jews," right? And it says it's in three languages that this is said: Greek, Latin, and Aramaic or Hebrew. And it's affixed to the cross. Now, there's one of the gospel writers. There's only one. Luke is the only one who tells us that it was affixed above him or over him. And so some people think, well, that necessitates there has to be that lowercase t. And it could be. That could be. The other thing it could be that if you imagine someone being crucified and hanging down, there could have been room on that capital T to affix that above their head, depending on how low they are hanging on the cross.
His arms would have been above his head as he kind of slouched down in that.
So again, I'm not going to go to bat on that. And here, I probably should have said this earlier, and I'm going to give you a quote from Josephus here that I think is pretty interesting. I guess let me give you both these quotes from Josephus. But the Romans, what is clear to me after reading, when you read all the texts that are available in the ancient world about crucifixion, we don't have a ton, but we have a significant number. When you read all of them and you think about them together, it's clear that the Romans, the actual mechanical part of crucifixion took place in a number of different ways. And I'm going to read you a section in a little bit that proves that, basically shows that. So what was important to them, again, that this was a public display, that it was done in a way to bring shame and, to maximize humility that was humiliation, I guess would be a better way to say it, this being brought upon this person. That's pretty much common, but there were a variety of different ways that they did it. Let me read two different things. So this first one, this is from Josephus, and this is from part of his writing that's called Antiquities of the Jews. And he's talking about a period of time that we've talked about before, the intertestamental period. So that period, it's broadly the Second Temple period, from the building of the Second Temple up through the time of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And this is...
And Josephus is a historian,
Josephus is a Jewish historian. He's called Flavius Josephus because he's trying to explain to the Flavian dynasty, and the Flavians are Romans. He's trying to basically defend, in a sense, the Jewish people to the Romans, make them understandable, because the Jews are his own people, but he's also kind of paid by the Romans. So he's trying to kind of make this understandable.
He's kind of trying to ride the fence and help the Romans understand the Jews.
Right. So he's talking about the intertestamental period, and he's talking about a time. We've talked about the Maccabees before, and the Maccabees came in as revolutionaries, and the oppressors at that time were people called the Syrians. This is before the Romans had come in. The Syrians were oppressing the people. They were forcing the worship of false gods. Antiochus Epiphanes. We've talked about that whole thing.
Yeah.
So there you go. You got it. So the Maccabees come in and they have this revolution. Now here's the really sad thing about this is, and actually, again, I've said before, it helps us understand John 10, I think, when Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, like all these other leaders who come before me, because the Maccabees were the heroes of the people. I've mentioned that the disciples, most of the disciples were named after them. Simon Cyrene or Simon Cyrene that we just mentioned that carried the cross, probably named after a Maccabean king. Something like 90% of the young boys in Palestine during his spare time were named after one of the Maccabees. So they were the heroes of the people. But within 2 generations, they had themselves become oppressors of the people. One of the sons of one of the Maccabee original, the Hasmonean family, the original Maccabees that led the revolution, was a guy named John Hyrcanus, and his son was a guy named Alexander Jannaeus. So kind of interesting. By the 2nd generation, you've got this Jewish king who's named after a Greek, right? Named Alexander, and Alexander. You find people who are then beginning to rebel against him, people in Judea who are rebelling against him for the very reasons that his family had led a rebellion, because they're saying, we are the true people of God, and we are the ones who really try to do things right. And so there's a rebellion that's led against him, and he has to flee for a period of time. Well, his forces eventually take over, and then when he comes down back into the area and is able to take over again, he goes to this city. Bethome is the city, and it says he besieged them therein. This is where the rebellion had kind of taken place and kind of started. When he had taken the city and gotten the men into his power, he brought them to Jerusalem. Now, this goes along with what we said earlier. Crucifixion wasn't just a matter of getting rid of these people. He wanted to make an example of them. So he didn't kill them.
Yeah, he could have run them through with a sword right then and there.
But it was too remote, right? So instead, what he did, he brought them into Jerusalem. Now, here's the really amazing thing. This isn't a Roman doing this. This is a Jewish king, okay, a Maccabean king who crucifies 800 of his own countrymen in one day. And furthermore, here's part of the humiliation of it. While they are on the cross and while they're still alive, he brings his children, their children and their wives, and has them killed in front of them in order to show that. So that's when I was talking earlier about that it was really kind of a vindictive kind of revenge, this kind of thing. That's an example of that, just a horrible example of that. Here's the other thing I wanted to share from Josephus. This is from a different book of his. And by the way, that was, if you want to read it, you can find it in Book 13 of Antiquities. So that's the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 13, Chapter 14.
Well, there's some links in the show notes. I'm not.
You can check me out, make sure I'm not making this stuff up. So there's another book that
Book 13. What page? What page though?
Depends on the edition. There's another. Book that Josephus wrote. He wrote four overall. This one is called The Wars of the Jews, and it's talking about the Jewish rebellion. And again, remember, he's writing for Romans, kind of trying to explain this. And so there's there's too much work, too much scholarship that's been done on Josephus. I can't go into it here, but he's really trying to, it's called apologetic history, we think. He's trying to help explain his countrymen to the Romans. And he's talking about when Titus and Vespasian came. This is a later period of time than the time of Jesus, when they destroyed Rome, and that revolution was taking place when they were trying to take over. And here's what I was talking about. The Romans crucified in a number of different ways. And when I read this the first time, it really helped me understand this. Here's what it says. And so, Titus would catch 500 of them every day. Sometimes he would catch more. This is Josephus again talking about this period of time. And by the way, this is something that Josephus was an eyewitness to, because he was alive during this period of time. In fact, he was a revolutionary. And He says he did this again in order to he was doing these things in order to make an example of these Jews. But then it says the soldiers out of their wrath. So the Roman soldiers had gotten so mad about these rebels and the length of time they had made them there. Out of their wrath and hatred they bore the Jews. They nailed those who were caught one after one way and one after another and another to the crosses by way of jest. So in other words, in order to make fun of them, again, you see the humiliation they're bringing on them, but they're so mad at them, they're nailing them all kinds of different ways to the crosses. So they're using all kinds of different, maybe upside down, maybe, different figures and this kind of thing. We have another description of this in another place. And it says and this is the part that's often quoted, when their multitude was so great, the room was wanting for the crosses and the crosses were wanting for the bodies. So, there was not even room for all the people who were being crucified. And often, as I said, their bodies were just left on the crosses and, wild animals would come and, whatever, and their bodies would just decay and eventually fall off the cross was the way that the Romans did that. But
so the moral of the story is don't surrender.
don't
just fight it out.
Don't get it to the Romans. So, So there were a variety of different ways that people were crucified. So, every year this time you'll have Time magazine or whatever. In fact, when I was a student, John Weatherly always called this the biannual nod to God, that, all the major news magazines and everything would kind of, sorry, I didn't mean to make you do a spit take there, but they would do
the biannual nod to God.
They'll do crucifixion of Jesus and everything. And so archaeologically, I've mentioned this before, in 1968, until then, let me go back and say this. Until then, there were some who argued that Jesus' body would have been left on the cross, that the detail of him being buried, which we're going to get into in just a minute, the detail of him being buried was ahistorical, because they would say crucified people were not buried. And I would say typically that was true. But we have at least two examples now, archaeologically, of people who were crucified who've been buried. And the first one was pretty significant. 1968, right after the 7 Days War, in a section of Jerusalem, and we mentioned this again in one of our archaeology episodes, in an area, a neighborhood called Givat HaMivtar, there was, as they were fixing the damage from the war, so this is afterwards, they're fixing the houses and so forth, they discovered the entrance to a cave in Jerusalem. And of course, Jerusalem is one of these cities that has been built on one layer after the other. We talked about that before. And this cave ends up that it was a series of tombs, not just one tomb, but it was a series of interconnected tombs. And they found a total of dozens of bodies. And we're going to talk about how burial customs took place, but in these bone boxes called ossuaries. We'll come back and talk about that more a little bit later. They found dozens of these things, and one of them they found was a man of his 30s or so. He would have been probably a revolutionary. Okay, because it would fit time-wise with this. This is probably around 80, 70 is what we think when he would have been buried here. And the significant thing about him is that there was an iron nail still in his ankle bone. Now, so here's an example of what we think was a crucified man. We think it because of the iron nail in his heel or his ankle, and he was buried. Clearly his family went through the procedures of burial again, which we'll talk about later. Now we have since, and this is was just published in 2019, but wasn't discovered until 2006. In North Italy, in the Po River Valley, there was another crucified man. Now his ankle did not have, his heel did not have a nail still in it, but the hole in his calcaneum, his heel bone, was consistent with a nail being driven in. And in fact, when they did microscopic study, from 1968 to 2006, our technology is much better in order to examine these things. Yeah. They could determine that there was a nail, they think, that was driven in through his heel bone. Now, all kinds of things I want to say here. Let's make sure see if I can get them in order. But one of the things that people will talk about, the man's name was Yehohanan, probably, in the man who was found in Jerusalem in Givot HaMivtar. And so the nail was driven in from the lateral to the medial. So in other words, it was driven in from the outside of his ankle into the wood. And so this caused people to think, well, crucifixion probably didn't take place then the way it's often depicted with Jesus. If it's through his ankle and kind of from the outside in, then one of two things has been proposed. Either his legs kind of were straddling each side of the cross, and his ankles, if you can imagine, were nailed in from the right and the left. Or some people think that he may have been, like, his legs, if you can kind of imagine, side saddle, so to speak, his legs kind of knees kind of turned to one side, and his ankles placed one over the other, and the nail driven through, or two nails used to drive through. It's probably not a long enough nail to go through both of his ankles. And so that's another way some people think that this may be the case. And so you'll sometimes see this in magazines. Well, the crucifixion of Jesus didn't take place the way we imagine. We have this archaeologically. Again, I would remind you that even on the same day, according to Josephus at least, Romans would sometimes crucify in a number of different positions. We have from church history. Now, this is not necessarily, we have to take this somewhat with a grain of salt. But from church history, we're told that Peter was crucified upside down, for example. I mentioned the capital T and the small t. Sometimes crosses were, they think, literally crosses, like X's, like capital X's, and people would be crucified in that way. So the big thing I want you to keep in mind is anytime somebody says, well, this is the way Jesus was crucified, well, there were a number of different ways that crucifixion could take place. And all we can go by are the very, and if you think about it, 50% of the gospel narratives deal with this, but they don't really say too much about the crucifixion other than that he was crucified. Because most people in the original readers, that would have immediately evoked something they would have understood.
Yeah, I think so what do you think about, when we talk in Hebrew, or, no bones of his are broken to fulfill the prophecy,
right?
So how should we think of this? I don't know. I mean, I'm not trying to put on what the scripture says, but is a hole in the ankle breaking his bones? Right. I think that's the thing that kind of pops in my mind.
Well, John, only gospel writer that mentions that's John, and he mentions it in chapter 19, 35 through 37 or so, I think. And his big thing is talking about, there's another practice. I really wasn't planning on talking about this. I've written about this a lot, but it's a practice called crurifragium, the breaking of the crurus, which is the what we call the what do we call that? The big bone of the thigh.
The femur?
Femur, yeah, thanks. The Latin name for that is crurus. And so they would break the legs on the cross, and believe it or not, I don't write very. I used to write articles and that kind of thing. I don't do that much anymore, but I was asked to write just last year a thing about this that's going to be published in some book someplace.
You don't even know where it's going.
Well, it's a volume of I can't remember the name of it. It's a volume
But what's the Latin name for femur? You remember that?
Crurus. It's Jesus, John, and History. There's a series of books, and I've got another article in there. But anyway, I did a paper years ago, and so they finally got around to putting a book together out of that, and so they asked me to do that, and I'm really out of practice at it. But anyway, so if you want, there's two different articles I've written on the breaking of the legs. I don't want to spend a ton of time on that, but it's a detail, the way they would speed up the death of Jesus. And again, I'm going to tell you this: be careful. You're going to hear, if you're preaching on this, or if you hear somebody preaching on this. We're not even sure exactly how. If you read some commentaries, they will give you details that I can find no reason for in the ancient record.
Okay.
And what it seems to be is that it's repeated from one commentary to the other, and so all I'm saying is just be careful about that if you're preaching. or teaching this. My point is just we can't have as much certainty exactly. So what you'll hear often is that it is the reason for the speeding of death was from asphyxiation. And there was a medical doctor who did a study on this several years ago, and you can read all about it if you want. But there's two different medical doctors that have studied this pretty in depth, to the point of doing trials where they didn't crucify someone, but they tied them up in the shape of a cross and checked on their oxygen levels and all this kind of stuff. And so there's lots to think about with all of this. It's very hard to have too much exact certainty. And again, I don't know that that's the primary point, right? The gospel writers, as I always say, the gospel writers could have given us that description if they'd wanted to. If we believe that these are inspired by the Holy Spirit, then God could have inspired them to give us these details. But we don't necessarily have them. All we know is that so I guess what I'm trying to say, culturally and archaeologically, what we learn is that this would have been a point of humiliation. It would have been done in a public way. Those are the things that I think that can add to our understanding of what's happening. But to say that it's exactly this way and that's what's happening, they try to explain the flow of blood and water. When the spear, again, only in John do we have this detail that a Roman soldier pierces his side with a spear, and there's a flow of blood and water. And I think it has as much to do to go back to some of Jesus' statements, and for John to say, "Look, this is exactly what happened. It happened exactly the way he said." But anyway, I don't want to go too far into that. But go ahead.
But the important thing for us out of this is to picture like he was crucified and what that meant.
Absolutely.
And we oftentimes, we do this a lot with scriptures. We're taking it from like we need to know like specific details,
right?
Like they were writing this as we would write a historical document today, and that's not the point necessarily of what they're writing. They're writing to talk about the crucifixion and what that meant, but not about what things we might be fixated on, like, well, where exactly were the nails, or were his feet on the side or in the front?
I think that's right. And again, for some, there's a reason for some Christians that seems to be a bigger deal than for others, but and I don't necessarily want to go into all that. But let's talk about nails themselves, because this is actually a controversy. Is there are some you'll see who say that nails typically were not used in crucifixion at all, and really nails. They're again, if you've seen the Passion of the Christ or any other. The driving of the nails into his hands and feet is a big deal, right? It's usually a big dramatic part of the whole story, and we don't even have that in the Gospels. What we do have, though, in the Gospel of John is a reference to nail prints. He says to Thomas in chapter 20, for example, thrust your fingers in the nail prints in my hand and the nail prints in my feet, right? So John seems to suggest that nails were used in the crucifixion. Ropes could be used. Ropes were sometimes, we know historically from descriptions, ropes were sometimes used. In other words, people were hung on the cross with means of rope instead of nails. Part of the reason for this is nails, and I could tell you more about this than you care to know, but nails were... the iron was very valuable, and there's even one really interesting comment made in an ancient writer that some people thought the nails used by crucifixion could be used in certain kinds of magical formulas, and so so a lot of times those were the nails were certainly reused. So that's why we think that we don't have very many examples of people that we found nails in their heel. The reason that we found it in the heel of the Givat HaMivtar man is that the end of the nail...
They couldn't get it out?
They couldn't. It seems to have curved. They think it hit a knot maybe in the wood, and the nail curved up, and so they couldn't get it out of his ankle bone. And so that's the reason that because the other ankle, it was gone, but they would reuse these nails. Again, iron was very valuable, and so So that's part of it as well.
I have to tell you, Brian.
What's that?
It's a gross story.
It really is, and it's and again, it shows us, and I'm not trying to minimize the degree of the suffering that Jesus had on the cross. That's not at all my purpose, but sometimes to focus on that to the exclusion again of the significance of this idea that he died on our behalf is, for me at least, at least as significant, I suppose I would say. So nails would often be salvaged, and reused, like I said, some people apparently were trying to find them to be used for other purposes. So before we get to burial, then, other questions on crucifixion, and again, we're thinking just kind of broadly, culturally and archaeologically, crucifixion in the ancient world.
I think the thing that you said that really stuck out to me, and I had not read Josephus, the Jewish antiquities.
Right.
I've read the Jewish War, but
Wars.
but how they had or the Jewish War, how they had done that to themselves. That the Jews had done this even before the Romans really brought it onto them. It was back during some of that Greek time. It reminded me a little bit. This is a side tangent, but like we talked about with. Dr. Knight, Dr. Michelle Knight. She talked about, like, in Judges, we didn't have to worry about the Romans just doing it to, we did it to ourselves, our own people. So here we have another instance of this, of people being, not following God, crucifying their own people, and then, guess what? Now the Romans, I don't know who did it first or who adopted the practice first, but that it was even they were doing it to themselves.
Well, and that's that's again when you think about when Jesus says, "I'm a different kind of king," and that was what really Dr. Knight was pointing to as well. That Jesus is coming to be a different kind of ruler, a different kind of leader, and he's saying even these Maccabees, and by the way, he's doing this. He's making the statement during the feast of dedication, what we call Hanukkah, which is a time where you celebrate the Maccabean kings, and he says, all who came before me are thieves and robbers, and I am the good shepherd. I am the one who will lay down my life for the flock. And so here's a difference, is that the Maccabean kings, even within a generation or two, were not on behalf of the people. They were doing things for selfishly for themselves, and
they became the oppressors themselves.
Right.
They liberated them and became the oppressors.
Exactly.
They became the new oppressors.
Exactly. And so Jesus,
and they were kinsmen.
Jesus says, "I'm not that kind of king." Right.
Yeah. Very cool.
We'll do. Have we ever done John 10? We should do John 10 sometime.
I think we've done John 10. I don't know. Maybe we'll figure it out.
Okay.
All right, so we've done crucifixion. I think that was great stuff to think about crucifixion, and that, again, not getting lost in the details.
Right.
John talks about the touching the Jesus talks about touching my hands and my feet, but the main point out of all of this is the crucifixion and what that culturally meant about Jesus on the cross and what it meant to the people that saw this.
I think that's right. So let's talk about burial just a little bit. I've already mentioned this a little bit. It's somewhat unusual to bury a crucifixion victim, but we have at least two examples of this now with the man I mentioned earlier, Jehohanan. It's often mentioned, or the Givat HaMivtar man, I sometimes will call him. That he was buried clearly after this. And then the man who was found in Italy, and again, he was a middle-aged man, found in Italy who had been crucified, was buried in the ground, which is a little bit different. Again, Jehohanan was found in an ossuary. His bones were found in an ossuary. This was a skeleton that was found in the ground as they were, I think it was laying a trail, train tracks or something. I can't remember. They accidentally, most archaeology is accidental. And so there's at least two examples. In fact, the only two skeletons that we have that show signs of crucifixion, both were buried now. So at least two. Now the burial in Italy seems to be a little bit different. Jehohanan was buried in a family tomb, so it seems like he was cared for in the same way that Jesus' body was cared for after his crucifixion. We'll get into that in a little bit. But the man in Italy, they think he probably was buried in the wilderness, kind of as a way of further. And there's examples of this
Casting him out.
Basically, yeah, he's an outsider. We're going to bury him out in the wilderness in the dirt, and that's kind of the way it is. In Jerusalem, often, as I mentioned, there were these caves that were used, and they weren't technically naturally occurring caves. These were in Jerusalem, mostly places that were former quarries. It's interesting geographically, or geologically, I guess I should say, there are two different kinds of limestone that make up the hills in Judea. There's a softer, crumbly kind of limestone that's not good for building, and there's a harder limestone that most of the houses and the significant buildings like the temple would have been built with. So what happens is these are in layers, so they would go in, the people who are quarrying these for use in building would go in and they would cut out a layer of the harder limestone, if you can kind of imagine, in pockets, and they would leave behind this kind of crumbly limestone around it. Now, those where they would go in and cut these out, they would kind of make them into the shape of a circle or a semicircle, if you can imagine, and they made perfect tombs then. And so we have more than one example of these places that were used as cemeteries that had been former quarries, because they'd hollow these out. So what would often be done is there would be these rock cut, if you can imagine, chambers, and then there would be in the side of these kind of alcoves that would be carved in, and there were these ossuaries that would be placed in there. Often there was also a platform or two that would fit a full-size body. Kind of imagine a operating table or something like that, but carved out of the stone, the actual stone there. Now, I mentioned Golgotha earlier. So if this was one of those places, you can kind of imagine how when you have these pockets carved out and then the crumbling around it, there are more than one example where this looks like a skull, kind of the eye sockets and the mouth, if you can kind of imagine that all together. And that's why we think that this is probably where Golgotha got its name, the place of the skull. But beside that, then, what they would do, the burial custom, there's what's called, of course, we have a way of burying, and we again, this is culturally where we think about a cemetery, right? And we've all been to a graveside service, and we kind of think about a burial in those terms. But if you go all over the world, in different places, even today, people treat bodies differently. They eat in respect, but they treat them bodies differently. This is a part of our cultural customs. And again, this is a perfect example where we tend to think of it in this way. But we know that Jesus' body was laid in one of these kind of family tombs. There was what's called, and I'm just talking about the custom in general at the time now. So there's what's called a primary burial, which is when the body would be placed on this kind of carved
the slab,
right? If you want to think of it that way, they would be wrapped. Often it would begin that way. They'd be wrapped. They would be anointed with spices, and we have a couple of examples of this talked about in Scripture. And what those spices would do is they would help the process so that there wouldn't be putrefaction. Basically, it was more a way of kind of preserving the body, not preserving in the sense that it would be maintained, but to keep it from smelling, to keep it from kind of putrefying in a nasty kind of way. And then there's the secondary burial, would happen typically a year later. Mourning, by the way, for your family would usually be a week long, unless, and this is from a later writing, that parents, you were supposed to mourn for an entire year, was the idea. When your mom or dad died, you mourned for a year. But we have an example of this in John chapter 11, you might remember, when we have, even after Lazarus had been dead for 4 days, they were still mourning, right? And his sister went out to the tomb, that was a normal thing. They were just assuming she was going there to cry, to wail. The community would come together, and it was usually a week-long a mourning period that they would go through for, like, a brother, for example. So So after that year, though, after the first year, there's what's called a secondary burial. And the family, again, would be involved in this typically, where they would go and they would gather together the bones. So at this point, typically the body had broken down to the point that it was more skeletal remains. And they would gather those bones and they would put them in either a wooden or stone box. And again, what we have are stone boxes because that's what survived. But they were called ossuaries. And what you got to imagine is kind of just a square, a rectangular box with kind of a carved lid. And there's depending on your status in society, they can be very fancy or very plain. And we have hundreds of examples. If you ever visit the Holy Land, you probably saw some of these when you were there. There's hundreds of these around in different places that these bone boxes were found. And basically they're just long enough. The femur is the longest bone in the human body, and they're long enough to fit the femurs in. And they put the bodies in there. Often there would be an inscription, maybe the name or a family relationship. So that's how we know Yehohanan's name and his father's name is inscribed there as well. The interesting thing there is his was not the only, and this is pretty common too, his was not the only body in that ossuary, but sometimes one ossuary would be used for multiple bodies. And there's also the skeleton in Yehohanan, the Givat HaMivtar man. There's also the skeleton of a 3 or 4 year old child that was in the box with him. So probably some kind of relation. And especially for a child, you wouldn't necessarily have their own ossuary, but they would use a family member's ossuary. But these bone boxes then would be placed in these alcoves that you can kind of imagine carved into the sides of these chambers. So eventually you'd have kind of a whole family there together, if you will. Now there's a couple of details that are very important here in the Gospels. One of them is in Matthew 27. Okay. Go ahead and read Matthew. I think you've got this for us, 57 through 61, Matthew 27, 57 to 61.
Yeah. As evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb.
Several important things here. One is Joseph Arimathea is a very significant man, wealthy man. One of the reasons that we think crucifixion victims were not frequently buried is you would have had to identify with this person who was just killed as a criminal. And so Joseph of Arimathea, though, was willing to do that. He goes and gets the body, but he says he lays him in a new tomb, and one that has just been cut. So you see the significance of new tomb there is, in other words, it had never been used before. There were no ossuaries in the wall. There's no other bodies in there. And this is the significance of this, of course, is when the resurrection takes place, it's going to be very clear that there is no body there then. When they go in, when Peter and John go in and look, when the women go to see the tomb, nobody is there. It mentions a stone being rolled across the entrance, and this is a common detail. This isn't an unusual thing at all. The reason for that is I mentioned wild animals earlier, jackals and so forth that are prevalent throughout that area. Could go and disrupt a body, and that would be a disgraceful thing, and you didn't want that to happen to a family member. And so these stones, that's why they would be placed across that. Now, what's significant is Pilate, if you look a little bit later there in Matthew 27, down to about 65 or so, not only was that stone laid across there, but then people came and reminded him, well, this guy said he was going to raise from the dead. So Pilate actually put a seal on the stone. The stone was not something that Pilate ordered. The stone was just a part of the whole complex, but he put his seal on there to make sure that no one came to kind of disturb it, so to speak, is kind of the idea. And then you'll remember that the women came. It says that they waited past the Sabbath. Oh, the last thing I was going to say on that passage you just read, it said that Mary and the other Mary knew where it was. They were watching, so there was no mistaking the tomb. At least two of the gospel writers, I think Matthew and Mark, both make a big deal out of it. They knew where it's being laid. Maybe Luke as well. I can't remember off the top of my head right now, but they make a point that they knew where the tomb was, and they would have paid attention to this. So then they come back on the first day of the week after the Sabbath is over. They wait till the Sabbath's over. They come back on the first day of the week in order to anoint his body. Although John tells us that Nicodemus already brought spices to do this. So look at chapter 19 of the Gospel of John, verses 39 and 40. I think you've got that there.
He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs.
So this is, he here is Joseph of Arimathea that you mentioned earlier. So Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. Nicodemus was mentioned back in John chapter 3, you'll remember. He was also mentioned in chapter 11, wherever it is, where they're talking about what should we do about this. And they said, oh, are you his disciple too? And so, again, he was kind of a secret disciple. But here he helps Joseph of Arimathea with his burial. Now, here's another controversial thing. You know, the translator said 75 pounds. The word that's used is basically 100 weight. And the idea is a Roman pound is a little bit less than an English pound. And so 75 pounds is 100 Roman pounds, 75 of our pounds. But that's an extraordinary amount of spices.
I was going to say, that's an intense amount of spice.
Typical amounts would be maybe 5 pounds or a little bit more is the spices that would be used in order to anoint a body. So now this is significant in a number of ways. First, I mean, just the transport of that. And some people say, well, this can't be historical detail because how's he going to carry? Imagine, 75 pounds being carried.
A body.
But we're talking about two wealthy and powerful individuals. So, they had plenty of servants that could have brought it. Some people say it's just a ridiculous amount to put on a body. I think the primary thing here is to think about and then there's the cost. You might remember just a few days before this, according to John, that we had Mary who anointed Jesus' feet, and they talked then about what an extravagant thing this was. Well, we're talking about many times more. Some people have tried to estimate the amount of spices would have probably been a year's wage or more. We're talking about a significant amount. And so, or $300,000, or I'm sorry, $30,000, something like that. Yeah, I know. I always get my zeros off.
You're making more money than I am, bro.
I know. But anyway, they they'll talk about that, and is this a historical detail? But I think again, probably this has to do with the degree to which Nicodemus was now venerating or recognizing
an honor. It was like kind of an honor thing.
And so,
I mean, Joseph of Arimathea has already given him the tomb.
Yes, right.
You know what I mean? Like he's already given him the tomb. There's already an expense. There's already expense being taken here, and so and then it's another way of maybe showing honor there.
And so
to Jesus.
So they, then they anointed his body, and as it says, John says, in keeping with the Jewish burial customs. So just a little bit about the burial there. Again, a little bit different than what we think. The women, as they're coming to the tomb, you might remember one of the discussions is who's going to roll away the stone so that we can get in there, and they get there and they find the stones rolled away already, the tomb's empty. Matthew describes the detail that there was a guard placed. There were 2 guards placed there at the tomb, and later gave testimony, and they gave false testimony that his body was stolen, and just very interesting in keeping with that. But again, I just wanted to think in terms of burial customs, a little bit different than what perhaps we'd be used to in a graveside service in our day. So Jesus died, again, on our behalf. Significance is he died as a substitute for our sins, and then was buried according to the Scriptures, as Paul says in John 15.
Yeah, and then there's significance in each one of those.
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
significance of the cross per se, not just running through with a sword, but kind of this arrogant display on the behalf of the Romans, to make him low. Yeah. And then you have the in his burial, the honor that some are giving to him as well, even in the spices and so forth.
Jesus says, when he's asked about a sign, at one point he says, I'll give you no other sign than the sign of Jonah. And just as Jonah was 3 days in the belly of the whale, then, the Son of Man will be 3 days in the belly of the earth. And so we have this kind of resurrection narrative that we're prepared for, but we'll talk more about next week. So.
Excellent. Well, Brian, thanks for walking us through some of that history of crucifixion and burial. I think that's important for us, again, is to understand the significance of the resurrection. We have to understand the significance of the crucifixion as well, and what that meant to the people that were there and saw it, and the scandal of the cross in some ways, as you alluded to, that we have that later on, that this is a scandal that Jesus died on a cross, that God died for us on a cross, a symbol of humbling and degradation during that time. So thanks so much, and we'll look forward to that conversation about
I'll just wish for our listeners
Jesus coming out, too.
I'll wish for them a Holy Week that's full of significance and meaning for them, and time to remember what Christ has done on our behalf. So
absolutely.
Look forward to talking to you too again, Ryan.
All right. Thanks, Brian.
All right.
Talk
Best
to you later.
wishes. Bye.
Bye. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. You can find show notes, links, and more at thebiblebistro.com, and find links there to follow us on social media. Next week, Brian and I, in preparation for Easter Sunday, are talking all about the resurrection. We hope you will join us for that. Thanks again for listening and sitting with us at the table in the bistro. We will be back Tuesday.